Mini episode 1086 of the FDH Lounge is brought to you by Sportsology, delivering unconventional columns and webcasts about sports, TV, music, movies, and more. Follow them on the web at sportsology.com.
The FDH Lounge. You'll want to schedule your life around it.
A long time ago, on a gloomy, wet Cleveland spring night, two men stand alone amidst the late-night drizzle. Their voices echo across the vacant station parking lot as they debate the merits of the great American radio show that have been missing for far too long. On that night, an idea was born. That idea became the FDH Lounge. Welcome to the FDH Lounge.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to FDH Lounge mini episode number 1086. This is FDH Managing Partner Rick Morris here today, and we have a very, very special segment. We are doing a segment of the show within the show, the FantasyDraftHealth.com Insider. Nice to get to go back to our roots from time to time and talk some fantasy sports, in this case, fantasy football. And we are doing so with a gentleman who is involved in a project that is going to take fantasy sports in a completely different direction than what we have ever seen before. So we're going to talk with him a little bit about the current fantasy landscape at the outset here, and then we're going to delve into his project. And it really is sort of a mind-blowing approach to fantasy sports, and approaching it both in a business sense and a participatory sense for you, the player out there, different than anything that we have ever seen before. I speak, of course, of Derek Siskin. He is the founder and chief of creative for the Crown League. And, of course, that's thecrownleague.com. You can go check it out from there. At Derek Siskin on Twitter, where he is keeping everyone apprised of the project to come, as well as talking about fantasy sports and other things in general. Derek, it's a pleasure to get you on the show today, sir. How are you today?
I'm doing really well. Thanks for having me on, Rick.
It's our pleasure. Glad to have you on. Glad to talk fantasy sports with you, and of course your project. And I'm looking forward to getting into the details and being able to share that with our listeners. At the outset here, as we're looking at this, as I was going through your Twitter page here, you made a very interesting point, because one of the things that's always fundamental to fantasy sports is supply and demand. And you had a tweet where you were talking about it seems to me, I'll use the word, almost sort of unprecedented depth at the top of the quarterback position, how deep it is next year. It's really interesting how that is sort of 180 degrees removed from this year's NFL draft, where Dwayne Haskins of Ohio State, school that I root for, my dad's an alum, he, at this point in time, whether or not Murray goes pro, again, right now Haskins is sort of the number one guy by default, and somebody that everybody else might be killing themselves to get a piece of, even though he was only a starter for 1 year. So in the NFL, there is a very scant supply of great quarterbacking coming into the draft this year. But as you pointed out, in fantasy football, just the opposite. In 2019, even if you wait a while, you're bound to pick up somebody pretty good if you're very prepared.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's very interesting what you're seeing in the NFL right now, especially from a rules perspective, where they're calling a lot more defensive penalties, and they're really opening the game up for the offense, which is having a big effect on fantasy. And I feel as though the NFL is almost going the way of the NBA, where it's really very much predicated on offense, and obviously, you know, for fantasy purposes, that means big stats, big numbers all around. And the quarterback position, it's almost starting to resemble the college game, where it's just completely wide open, and you're seeing points scored at a record rate, and the stats, you know, as far as passing yards are concerned and completions, they're higher than ever.
Yeah, that is very, very apropos, and I got to say, you made a point that I couldn't agree with more strongly, Derek. We've talked about this on the show previously as far as comparing the NBA and the NFL and looking at it, and the explosion of the offensive game in both leagues in recent years, and it's a thing where you could almost draw a parallel between Mike McCarthy getting drummed out of Green Bay and what happened with Tom Thibodeau in Minnesota, the sense that life comes at you fast, and that you got to make sure you're up with the times as far as the way the game is evolving. And both of those gentlemen at the very least, were victims of the perception that the game had passed them by, and both of them are certainly going to have to readjust their philosophies if they're going to get back in. And you talk about the philosophies that sort of undergird what we're seeing in the league. I'll go to my Cleveland Browns making the decision to stay with Freddie Kitchens for next year, promote him to head coach. This is one of these things where it really is, when you're looking at it from a fantasy perspective, it seems like it's more important than ever before to look at what kind of a system guys are in, because you're either on something that's cutting edge in today's day and age or you're not. It seems like that's more of a drastic line back and forth than it used to be. A couple of years ago, you would have thought of Mike McCarthy as being well within the mainstream of the NFL. But the way the game is evolving these days, if you don't have one of these guys in there that is a proponent and a practitioner of all the cutting-edge offensive traits out there and working in some of the air raid and all the other things, it seems like your fantasy players might get left behind if they're not a part of that.
I mean, absolutely, and I think the NFL is very reactive when it comes to coaching. So, you see a guy like McVay on the Rams, and all the teams are trying to replicate that by bringing in these young guys, whether it be Cliff Kingsbury on Arizona or LaFleur in Green Bay. But yeah, I mean, as far as fantasy is concerned, it's great. It's great because, the more points, the better, the more yards, the better. And it seems like every team is really looking to create these offenses that are just, really predicated on the pass and just running up the scores, and so for our purposes, it's great. It's really exciting to watch.
But yeah, the quarterback play, you are right about that as far as maximizing what they have and having a relationship between the coach and player that is conducive to being able to get the most out of that. I say that as somebody who is a very strong Jared Goff proponent coming into the league. And Jared Goff subsequently rewarded my faith in him once he was paired up with Sean McVay. To a certain extent, it was the same thing with Baker Mayfield and Freddie Kitchens, which is part of why you see the Browns going in that direction. So it is one of these things where I think you're absolutely right. Teams are looking for that synchronicity between coach and quarterback, particularly if you've got a quarterback with a high upside.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I have had Mahomes on a bunch of my fantasy teams. What's interesting, though, is that the quarterback position in fantasy, the points are usually weighted where, there's not really much difference between the top guy and some of the guys that are later on that you can pick up in the late rounds. So right now, more than ever, there's just incredible depth at that position. And it's really just interesting to see what's going on with the game as far as the offense is concerned. Again, it's really great for fantasy purposes, and I think it's just really great overall from an entertainment perspective. It's just going to make the league grow even more and more. Absolutely,
and when you look at the players who end up, unfortunately, on the other side of the coin, letting you down and being busts, obviously injuries play a major part in that every year in the league, and you can't always forecast who those guys are going to be. But then you look at some other guys here, and again, I won't hesitate to throw myself under the bus with FantasyDraftHelp.com. We had David Johnson second on the draft board overall, and you don't often see this. You don't often see a circumstance where a great player can be so dragged down by the circumstances around him. DeAndre Hopkins had it happen a couple of years ago, just briefly, and then kind of bounced back to who he is. I had predicted coming into the year that Arizona was going to be amongst the dregs of the league, and yet that did not affect where I slotted David Johnson. And this year seemed to be a reminder that a lot of times those things will go hand in hand. So the exact circumstances of players as far as the team that's around them, the stability that's there, whatever, even beyond the offensive system, just the overall atmosphere of a team obviously can have a lot to do with whether a player will be a bust or not.
Yeah, I think that's a major thing that you have to take into consideration when you're dealing with fantasy. When you mentioned David Johnson, what it made me think of was Todd Gurley, a guy that had a really amazing season. But 2 years ago, that St. Louis Rams team, now they're LA Rams, but that Rams team, you need a well-balanced offense for fantasy purposes. I really am a strong believer in that because if you are taking a running back, for example, that's on a team with not the best passing game, not the best quarterback, then you're going to be playing from behind, and then they're going to be going away from the run. So, I think there's a lot of things that you have to take into consideration when you look at it through the lens of fantasy. I was just talking about this the other day with somebody in regards to picking a kicker, which is something that's a very tough thing to figure out in fantasy, and there's a lot of strategy around it. And usually the way I approach picking a kicker is, I'm targeting teams that are good at moving the ball down the field but might have a hard time capitalizing in the red zone. So it's just a very nuanced way of looking at the NFL through this lens of fantasy. When you're talking about these individual players, like a guy like David Johnson and the situation he was in this year with Arizona.
Very much so. Yeah, it's very, very nuanced in looking at how these things go and what circumstances you have to take into consideration and which ones not. As far as the way that the actual game on the field impacts what's going on with fantasy, it would seem also too. And you had talked about Patrick Mahomes there. This notion in the NFL now that because of the cap situation, probably the most valuable thing that you can have is a star quarterback on his first contract, on his rookie contract. So a guy like Mahomes, they're going to be aggressive with him right off the bat as far as turning him loose. Jared Goff, you saw that as well. To whatever extent Carson Wentz, he's having problems staying healthy, but Philly's had every intent of riding him as much as humanly possible. Same thing with Watson in Houston, same thing with Mayfield in Cleveland. So it's a circumstance now where I know in fantasy it used to be you had to wait a couple of years sometimes to anoint these guys as being on that top tier, and particularly with the greater depth that we have now and where it's a little bit amorphous as far as who might be the number 3 guy and who might be the number 10 guy. It seems like any kind of historical reticence that any of us might have had about going with a young quarterback as our number 1 guy, it would seem like that would be gone in most instances.
I mean, I think it's a great point because, historically when you looked at running backs, that was the one position where you could take a gamble to some extent, taking a well-regarded rookie running back, in the early second round, late second round, sometimes even late first round. And quarterback was a position that, you would typically wait on. But, even now you're seeing these guys that are thrust into situations and they're more NFL ready than they've ever been. And a guy like Baker is the best example of that. And a guy like Deshaun Watson last year, another great example of that. These guys are, they're playing in college right now, and I guess it's just the most, they're getting the best coaching that they've ever gotten, and they're just the most NFL ready that they've ever been. So I think, in fantasy, if there are guys that are targeted as being, the type of guys that can come in and play right away, people are definitely less hesitant than they've ever been to insert them right into a starting lineup, and it's been happening to great success.
Very much so, and it's helping to make this, again, one of the more exciting times ever in the couple of decades that fantasy football has been around and been a big thing. And it is, again, very interesting to be discussing this with you, Derek, because your new project that you've got coming up that you are launching for the 2019 season is really going to be something different than anything that we've seen before. The Crown League, something that, again, a league that's owned by the public, managed by experts, run on blockchain technology. A lot to unpack there as far as how this goes. So as best as you can, just kind of start to break it down for our listeners. We'll dig into this a little bit further, but how would you best describe the concept of the Crown League?
Yeah, so the Crown League at the highest level is the first professional fantasy football league. And what that means is if you look at, I think there's a great comp out there in esports, which has had a very rapid rise. And what esports did essentially was they took video game competitions, which was a very huge market with a impassioned fan base, and they aggregated that into these unified leagues and these branded franchises. And really what they did was they legitimized them in a big way, but they also professionalized something that wasn't considered a professional sport. So
we saw that as a great use case. And then what we also saw was, the Green Bay Packers, something where you have this, unique situation where you have a community that owns a franchise, right? And what we thought was, well, the dream is, as a sports fan, millions of sports fans, is to own a professional sports team, right? But that's only privy to select few individuals, the most wealthy individuals on the planet. So you're either a billionaire who can own a franchise, or you're a fantasy owner. And we saw this huge opportunity in between. So what we decided to do was create the first unified fantasy sports league. I know if you look out there right now, fantasy is this huge market. It's as popular as it's ever been. There's 60 million participants in North America alone, and they're spending upwards of $30 billion each year for fantasy. But even though that's the case, it's a completely fragmented market. And what I mean by that is there's millions of leagues, there's tens of millions of teams, and really what it boils down to is nobody cares about anybody else's team or league outside of their own. So, I used to call one of my best friends, who's actually now my partner in the Crown League, and I used to want to talk to him about fantasy. We were in the same league, and he would say, "I don't care about your team," and it made sense. Like, why would he care about my team? We're competitors, right? We're like,
right.
He doesn't want to talk about my team. And so we started thinking about this, and the more we dug down, we felt like, well, what if we were able to take the fan base aspect and the community aspect of professional sports and combine it with fantasy sports? And what we did was, and that's basically the genesis of how we came up with this idea. My third partner, Dan Nisanoff, he was somebody that was in our fantasy league at the time. And so the three of us, me, Matt Sposta, and Dan Nisanoff, we got together and we started conceptualizing this idea, and it really took on a life of its own. So what the league is going to be is we're going to launch in September of 2019 alongside the NFL season. 12 franchises that are going to be geographically located. So right now these are New York, Chicago, LA, Texas, Atlanta, Miami, and there's a couple more. Some that aren't dead set yet. Some are still up in the air. And what we're going to do is we are selling shares in the teams so that the public will own each team, and then each team is going to be led by an expert, a fantasy expert. So think about some of the leading guys, the most high-profile guys in the space, and those are going to be the GMs of the team. They're going to make a lot of the decisions, but they are going to be influenced and accountable to their owners, and it's really going to be like professional sports. It's really going to be like all of the other leagues that you see, and it's going to come all the way down to a content perspective. We're going to have live coverage around the league specific to our franchises and to our owners, and with this idea of people being able to own shares in the teams, there's going to be a marketplace where you can monetize your shares, where you can trade shares, and essentially where you could switch teams. So there's a lot of these really new and unique components to it, but it's what we're really ultimately trying to do is create this new experience that doesn't exist, and it's not going to be meant to replace traditional fantasy in people's home games, but we want to create the first premier unified national fantasy league, and that's what the Crown League is.
It is a hugely ambitious project, no question about it. And again, in looking at your initial announcement here, of course, you've got it to where the offering is being led by America's Executions LLC. Amerix, a FINRA-regulated investment bank. So this is a thing where, again, in terms of you and your partners, again, I'm curious in terms of you guys had played in a league together, but to be able to put together something on this scale, when you're looking at the skill set and the background of the partners involved in putting this together, what do you guys bring to bear here as far as, again, this, I can't even imagine how much must have gone into putting this thing together from the initial blueprints to where you've gotten it now. So what were some of the things that you guys have in terms of your skills where you were able to make this happen?
So my background is mostly in marketing and creative, and I was just a diehard sports fan, along with my friend Matt. We just love sports and we love fantasy, and I was in 4 leagues at the time, and I just remember sitting there at my desk job. I was doing a digital marketing job at the time, and I just remember thinking, there's something there. I'm so consumed by fantasy sports. It's just something that I love so much, but there hadn't been really any innovation in years, and really the last innovation was about 12 years ago when DFS came about. So I was thinking that, there's opportunity here, and so what is it? What is the opportunity here? And, Matt, his background is on Wall Street, and, so he had a good financial background, good business background. Our other partner, Dan, had a great background in fundraising, and he's a former venture capitalist that had all these successful businesses. And so the 3 of us, what we knew that we had to do was we knew we had to come up with the concept and really distill the concept. We knew the branding and the marketing had to be right. And then we knew we had to go out and do some fundraising and really build a team around the idea, execute an idea, because as you said, it's an ambitious idea. And we started this a little bit over a year ago, and the place that we started at is completely different than it is now. Right now we're 22 employees that are across the entire country right now. We're about to go out and sell the franchises to the public in the next couple of months. We're doing another round of fundraising, and actually, you had mentioned blockchain. Initially, blockchain was something that we had intended to do this through, but because of the environment right now, because of certain SEC restrictions, we actually went away from blockchain for the time being. It's something that we could always go back to. But now we're just going to do this through a regular SEC security process. And there's just so many different components to it, whether it be on the content side, whether it be on the community side. This is something that we intend to do where it's an on-platform experience, and people are going to be able to come onto our platform, communicate with co-owners, strategize, collaborate, vote on different matters pertaining to their roster, and try and influence their GM to make the decisions that they want, very similarly to the way that it exists in professional sports. And then beyond that, and part of the reason we wanted to do this, as each team was a geographically located franchise, was because we're also going to have a live component to this, where we're going to organize events where the owners can get together and they can watch their teams compete together, and they can cheer, and they can, have that financial and rooting interest where it's aligned together. So, again, we're really trying to do what we consider, the next evolution in fantasy, and give our consumer the ownership experience, and really give them something that they've never had before, the ability to feel like they are an actual owner of something. But unlike the Green Bay Packers, they have a real financial interest. It's not just something that they can hang on their wall, a certificate that says they're a Green Bay Packer owner. There's a real monetary interest in here. And so, it really is at the intersection of sports, fantasy sports, of esports, and of investing. And, if you look at the landscape right now, gambling is obviously getting less restrictive by the second. And even so, we anticipate that we can, venture into that world, whether it be having lines for our teams. But, still, we're an investment vehicle. You know, people are going to be able to buy shares in our team, and if you think about it, Rick, like when you buy shares in an Amazon or an Apple or whatever it is, there's no entertainment aspect there, right?
Right.
You can't, right, so you buy shares and then you just hold it. You don't really know so much why it's going up or going down on a daily basis. And so now we're saying, well, now you could buy a share in a fantasy team. You could share it with your friends and your family, and you could do this with your entire fantasy league. You could buy shares in one team, and you get the entertainment value, you get the financial value, and you get just this community value that doesn't exist right now in fantasy, especially at the team level, because it exists at the league level, right?
Right.
So you do a fantasy league with 12 people, and you guys can talk trash, and you could speak about the league at a high level. But what you can't do is have an experience at the team level. You know, you own that team by yourself. The highs and lows you experience by yourself, and then at the end of the season, you either win or you lose. There's this binary outcome, and it can be very unfulfilling. And as much as we love fantasy, and trust me, I love traditional fantasy, we just felt like there was a lot of opportunity to improve upon a lot of the limitations of the game.
Sure, and that's quite a story as far as how this came together. And I would say, when I asked the question, more or less what I expected. I figured you guys had to have skill sets and backgrounds that fit together very well to do this, and clearly that is the case. And point well taken about the blockchain that's subsequently not going to be a part of the launch of it. And I just editorialized, probably a wise decision in this climate. And like you said, you could always go back to that at some point if you wanted to, but duly noted that is not part of things as they stand now. So just kind of looking ahead here, again, you're in the rollout phase here. You're starting to get this out here. I know from your initial announcement you were talking about the inaugural draft being the summer of 2019. So that's a long ways off. Any meat on the bones yet as far as what, the format, the place, the whatever, or is it too soon to kind of get into that?
It's probably a little bit too soon. We're definitely planning right now for the draft. As far as the format goes, we're thinking most likely an auction draft, and we're going to stick to a lot of the fundamental, familiar type of format as it relates to fantasy, because what we're doing is already, very unique and very different. So, what we'd like to do is for the most part stick to some of the familiar aspects of traditional fantasy and standard fantasy. It will be a dynasty league, though, a dynasty/keeper league. So the league, when we do the draft, all the players will be available, and but all subsequent drafts will be rookies, free agents, and unprotected players. And I feel as though the GMs of some of these franchises are going to help dictate some of the rules and some of the format, but we have a lot of those things pinned down already, and the draft is going to most likely occur in August. We're still trying to lock down the venue, but all that information will definitely be shooting out over our social handles and over our website, so people will definitely have that information as it comes.
Absolutely. Last question I have on the format. Any sense yet as far as how deep the freeze might go? If it might be maybe the majority of the roster every year, a couple of the players, and any kind of early thoughts on how much of the roster might be available to be frozen from year to year?
We're thinking probably 50% of the roster.
Okay.
But again, that's still
sure.
a number that we're just trying to pin down. I think for the most part, what we're thinking is, one quarterback. We're having debates about all these things, because if you did a two-quarterback league in our league, and if we ever did expansion teams, it makes it very tough to do a two-quarterback league. But we're thinking one quarterback auction draft, fab for waivers, and a lot of the familiar components that people play for the most part. But Yeah, outside of that, there's going to be it's going to be very interesting how it's all going to operate and come together as far as how the ownership base, communicates with the GMs and the front office, how they're influenced by them, how they're accountable. I will mention that when we talk about the voting stuff, we're also talking about outside of just voting for different things having to do with the roster and trades and free agency. We're also talking about having the ability to vote to replace and retain your general manager. So, it's going to be a lot of elements that are very authentic to, the other professional sports. We really want people to feel that, they're a part of something that's bigger than just themselves. So, when we say that we're the first professional fantasy league, it's hard to really wrap your head around what that means, but these are just some of the elements that are going to contribute to that authentic experience.
Well, it is, again, fascinating to sort of peel back the curtain and get to talk about what this is like in the early stages as you guys are putting it together. And, again, we'd be interested in catching up with you subsequently, Derek, and continuing to trace this journey. So please don't be a stranger, but a pleasure to have you on the show today and get to talk fantasy sports with you and this great project, the Crown League, that people can check out at thecrownleague.com. So thank you very much for making time for us.
Thanks so much for having me, Rick, and you can follow us on Twitter, on Instagram, on Facebook, The Crown League, and obviously www.thecrownleague.com, our website. And again, I really appreciate you having me on.
It's our pleasure, Derek. Again, such an interesting piece of conversation here today. You guys really are delving into new ground and adding an innovation to a business that hasn't really seen anything like this yet. So best of luck with the project. Like I said, would look forward to continuing to correspond with you here on the show. And thank you, everybody, for tuning in today to FDH Lounge mini episode number 1086.
As we bring the show to a close, we would like to extend our deepest gratitude to NBC, CBS, ABC, Fox, all Clear Channel affiliates, TNT, TBS, USA, UPN, Deadspin.com, YouTube.com, YTMND.com, MySpace.com, various blogs, Fox News, CNN, CNBC, MSNBC, IamBoard.com, Billboard.com, Google.com, ESPN, ESPN2, ESPN News, ESPN Classic, NBA TV, NFL Network, Sports Time Ohio, Athlon Magazine, Comedy Central, Cartoon Network, The Boomerang Channel, QVC, BET, The Spice Channel, Steno Notebooks, Manwich, Papermate Office Supplies, waitresses, strippers, bartenders, garbage men, janitors, microwave popcorn, the writers of The Office, Scrubs, Entourage, My Name is Earl, Oz, Metalocalypse and the Boondocks, Aquafina, and the periodic table of elements.